Thank you. Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you had a nice lunch. So welcome back. I wanted to share a few thoughts with you on basically some of the fundamental drivers of our economy and how they can affect people's behaviors on a daily basis, and what that really means in terms of environmental impacts, and especially the circular economy. And these two spheres might seem quite uncorrelated at first, but I'm just trying to show with very basic economic principles that actually, the fundamental drivers of our economy have a definite impact on what we would like to see in a more circular and a more environmentally responsible economy. So that's what I will be talking about. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's still the first slide.
I can't see the slides. Okay. So yeah, you can move on to the outline.
Yes, outline.
Okay. I've lost the shared screen, so I don't really see the slides that you are seeing. But I have them on my end. So maybe just a few words of introduction. I work for the Research Center of the European Commission in the department that's in charge of the circular economy. So we're basically looking at accelerating the transition to a more resource efficient economy. And I work on a lot of topics, from waste management to recycling to just basically all the ways that we can make the economy more resource efficient. And before that, I was also working for the European Commission, but for the directorate that worked on macroeconomic policy and fiscal policy. So in this presentation, basically, I'll touch on both aspects and try to illustrate, as I said, how economic fundamentals drive towards more environmental friendliness or not. So moving on to slide 3. So I'll talk about very basic aspects. These on slide 3, I just put some definitions and some concepts of what people think the circular economy is. So there are let's say many subtle differences, but the idea is basically that we would have to maintain resources in the economy for longer, that we would have to reduce waste production, and that we would have to do more reuse, repair, refurbishing, recycling to extend the life cycle of materials in particular. So I'm going to have a look at how this is happening or not today, and the relationship with the economy. First of all, I'd like to start with a very basic examination of one of the fundamental economic parameters in any economy today, which is the interest rate, and what that means in terms of people's personal behaviors. The interest rate is basically the price of money. So if we look at one individual person, they have a preferred interest rate, which translates whether or not they would like to spend or to save, basically. So if the prevailing interest rate is below their preference, they would rather consume and maybe borrow some money to do that, or to invest. And if the interest rate is above, then if they have some money, they would rather save it. And if they don't, they did refrain from consumption. So there are, let's say, some risk dimensions and also behavioral dimensions, which are almost moral in that consideration of the interest rate. Basically, preference for the present is translated as short-term focus and also more conducive to consumption, without really thinking about tomorrow. And longer-term orientation would be more associated with saving, and also with maybe choosing more durable products that will have a longer lifetime and that will produce less emissions and less pollution over their life cycle. So these are really, let's say, at the microeconomic level, what the interest rate actually means. So moving on to basically the market, the interest rate as a market for money, we have basically people saving and people investing. And if the market was left to itself, then we would have an equilibrium price for money, so an equilibrium interest rate, which translates basically the balance between supply and demand, like in any market. We all know that this doesn't happen today in any major economy in the world because central banks intervene to manipulate the interest rate in a way that they think is more beneficial to the economy. What we have today, so moving on to this second graph, in most major economies, whether in the EU with the European Central Bank or the Federal Reserve in the US or the Bank of England in the UK or any really major central bank in the world, is that they're keeping interest rates low. And the idea is that they will spur demand and increase growth, at least in the short term. So how do they do that? Because it's a price, they have to manipulate the price at the same time as the quantity. So they also create new money that they distribute to the economy through the banks, basically. And that's what I think where it starts getting really interesting, because this creation of money and this lowering of the interest rate has a number of effects on, well, the real economy, so the materials and the products that we use. Are you on slide 6? So I'm moving on. I'm moving on now to slide 7. So having said all this, what I mean to say is that if you have a low interest rate or zero interest rate even these days, basically you're orienting people to consume. So they will choose to consume today rather than tomorrow. And also in terms of investment, they will choose riskier assets, more risky assets than if the interest rates were higher. So the positive side of this in terms of environment is that among the risky technologies, we have a lot of the green technologies and the resource efficiency projects. So basically, when we have access to more credit, people can invest in green technologies and improve their resource efficiency, among other things. In reality, the dominant investments are not really in green technologies and resource efficiency or low carbon technologies. They go to all sorts of projects, including, for instance, buildings, which, as we saw in the previous crisis at the end of the year 2000s, led to a lot of, for instance, buildings being built without having any use. So that's also vastly wasteful in terms of resources, but that's part of the bubbles that are created, obviously, by an expansion in money. The preference for present consumption, which is translated by low interest rates, is also, let's say, leading people to actually buy things without really thinking about how durable they are. So this, as I will show in the second part of the presentation, is also linked to inflation and inflation expectations. If people think that products are going to be a lot more expensive in the next few months and years, which is high inflation, then maybe they will anticipate their purchase and buy some more durable goods, thinking maybe I'll buy a dishwasher and I'll keep it for 15 years. In practice, that's not what's happening, because people are not really anticipating very high inflation for these goods, and that's what I'm going to look at in the next few slides. So I'm moving on to slide 8 and the following slides. What I did is I had a look at the actual figures for the EU economy of what inflation looked like, which is basically the increase in prices of all the goods and services that people spend their money on. And that's calculated by my colleagues at Eurostat, the European Statistics Agency. and used also by my colleagues at the European Central Bank for making sure that inflation is not too high. The picture that you have here is quite confusing because it represents all the categories of goods and services that are monitored by Eurostat, so everything that people spend their money on, basically. Why I wanted to show this slide is that you see that inflation is not equal in all the product and service categories. I mean, we see a central trend where most things actually went up. The average is from the year 2001, 40% inflation in total, but you see that some things got a lot more expensive and some things got a lot less expensive and really a lot cheaper than they were about 20 years ago. So I exclude, let's say, tobacco, because products like that are mostly the result of taxation. You can see that there is lots of variation. That's for prices that are indexed on oil. So sometimes they get very expensive, sometimes they get cheaper. But then there's a massive trend at the bottom of the chart for all what I call gadgets and information technology. So everything like computers, smartphones, photo equipment, video equipment, games, and actually to some lesser extent, also some other goods like fridges, dishwashers, etc. They got a lot cheaper, or at least didn't increase so much in price over the period. And I think that's quite interesting. In the next few slides, I'm having a look at specific categories to illustrate in more detail what I want to say. So I'm moving on now to slide number 9. In this slide, I'm looking at one of the categories that is monitored by Eurostat for inflation statistics, and that's clothing and footwear. So what we see here is that at the bottom of the chart, the price of clothing actually stayed almost constant in the past 20 years, and even at some point was cheaper. And buying new clothes was basically getting cheaper. At the same time, you can see at the top of the chart, that orange line, cleaning, repair, and hire of clothing, that got a lot more expensive. What that means is basically people have less incentive to repair their clothes or have their clothes repaired, and more incentive to just buy new clothes. So I'll let you conclude to yourself what this means in terms of resource efficiency. And moving on to the next slide, number 10, we see the same thing going in a lot of other goods and products that people buy. So here is household items. Household items is a category that includes the furniture and also the appliances like dishwashers and fridges that people buy. So you see that the household appliances actually got cheaper, 10% cheaper on average over the past 17 years, 18 years, basically. And at the same time, everything that has to do with services, so household services, but also repair of furniture, repair of appliances, and the goods and services for maintaining your house yourself, that got a lot more expensive. What this means is basically, if you have the choice between buying a new dishwasher that is made from virgin products and imported probably from maybe Asia or Turkey, and the choice between that and repairing your old dishwasher, basically the price balance doesn't really work, because it's getting more and more expensive to do some repair and maintenance and less expensive to buy new products. Okay, last slide looking at this, because it's always the same story. But in this category, which is transport, actually, we didn't really see any decrease in price, but it's the same idea. The cheapest, the lowest inflation was on cars, and the almost the highest inflation was on maintenance and repair of cars. So basically, even for big objects like cars, it's cheaper to buy a new one than to actually spend some money in repairing it. And so I don't know if that matches your personal experience, everybody inside the room, but basically the balance is more and more tilted towards getting new products rather than repairing them and maintaining them for longer. So as a partial conclusion to that, I'm now on to slide 12. I took an illustration from same sort of analysis that was done in Australia, but basically Australia, like other Western economies, has experienced the same kind of differentiated inflation in the past 20 years. So we see basically the same picture. That's what some economists have called biflation. So basically there is deflation, so products getting cheaper in especially the imported goods, durable and not durable, clothing, smartphones, even appliances, and the services to actually maintain them, and other services. I mean, it would be a much longer discussion, but you can see that things like education and healthcare also went up very much in price. We have this dichotomy between goods being cheaper and services getting more expensive. So basically, the balance between repairing, reusing, and even to some extent recycling, and getting some new virgin products is tilted towards getting some new products. And that is basically a fundamental trend that went through the whole economy for the past 20 years and maybe more. So this is my final slide. I'm on to slide 13 now. Basically, what I wanted to show with this short analysis is that there is a direct link with the fundamental drivers of our economy, like things like the interest rate, which is used right now to basically inject some more money in the economy and make people consume and spend to revive growth. But that has an impact in terms of the way people spend their money, obviously, and the way that resources are used. So my argument is that these price developments over the past 20 years are really not going in the direction of the circular economy, because we're making maintenance and repair more expensive, and we're making buying cheap imported goods more easier. So the environmental impacts of this are clear, because usually these products are made in countries with lower manufacturing standards in terms of emission and pollution. There is also some environmental impact in transporting them into where they are bought, like the EU. And it's also very much the typical linear economy of making, importing, using, and then disposing, which is the opposite of resource efficiency, basically. So what would be the conclusion for that, or maybe a more hopeful message, is that I think, well, we can choose maybe to do things slightly differently, and to favor more either making goods domestically or maybe importing fewer goods and making the ones that we have last longer, by also favoring maintenance and repair, and at the end of the life of the products, more recycling and more remanufacturing and manufacturing. So it's not all, let's say, all hope is not lost for the circular economy, but the fundamental drivers will have to change. And even though we have some tools like product policy, or like indications on sustainable finance, or where to invest money in green projects, it would have to go, basically, it would have to be accompanied by more helpful macroeconomic policy if we want to make sure that the circular economy becomes a reality. And that would be, let's say, my final thoughts is the circular economy is a bit of an abstract concept, or something that is more aspirational. The overall conclusion, which I think would be my contribution to the theme of this conference, what is, are we experiencing good growth or bad growth? The kind of growth that is triggered by injection of cheap money and lowering of interest rate, for me, is not very helpful, at least at the level of the EU, to transition towards more environmentally friendly and more resource efficient economy. So that's up for discussion. These are my thoughts on the idea, on the subject. So if you have any questions or any comments, I'd be very happy to hear them. Thank you very much.